Mark Sharman has been a pillar of the British media all his life. He's as mainstream as it gets, head of news and sport at ITV, director of broadcasting at Sky, cub reporter on the Derby Evening Telegraph. Not necessarily in that order, but he has found the UK press a little wanting in the age of COVID, and he's made a documentary about some of the consequences of that. It's good to see you, Mark. What has gone wrong with the British media since early March 2020?
Well, Mark, in a nutshell, we've forgotten to be objective, balanced and fair. All of the values that one would be taught in journalism seem to have gone out of the window. I could understand it in the early days of COVID, to be fair. We were all slightly scared of it. Nobody knew quite what was coming. And I think newspapers and television towed the line. 2.5 years later, with a lot of evidence coming now from all over the world about vaccine injuries and deaths, I think they've got to open their eyes and start reporting both sides, as you have been yourself.
The funny thing about it, though, is that what's interesting is that the UK broadcasting regulator, Ofcom, which basically regulates the entirety of TV and radio in the country, actually put its thumb on the scale and, to put it mildly, discouraged broadcasters from opening up the conversation.
Yes, that's certainly true. But again, that was in March 2020, and I could understand it at the time. But this far on, you know, journalists have got to start asking questions of both sides. I mean, I went to a press conference this morning with Dr. Asim Malhotra presenting evidence, and he basically called for the vaccines to be suspended altogether until we've looked at independent world data. Nobody, apart from GB News, nobody from the main television companies nor the main newspapers came to that. Now, they might have learnt a lot about the background, and they might have seen some figures which frankly are astonishing. The efficacy of the vaccine was presented, what the reality was, and his conclusion is actually that nobody under 70 needed the jab at all unless they were in ill health. And in fact, the vaccines are doing more harm than good in that age group. But nobody came to report it.
We've got a clip of Dr. Malhotra in your new documentary that you've just made. Let's have a look at what he said in your new film.
Having been double jabbed and being one of the first to take the Pfizer vaccine, I have, after several months, critically appraising the data, speaking to eminent scientists in Oxford, Stanford and Harvard, speaking to 2 investigative medical journalists, and being contacted by 2 Pfizer whistleblowers, reluctantly concluded that this vaccine is not completely safe and has unprecedented harms, which leads me to conclude that it needs to be suspended until all the raw data has been released for independent analysis.
Albert Bourla, who's the head guy at Pfizer, has just announced, he's quadruple vaccinated, and he's just announced he's got COVID for the 2nd time in a month, as happened to Joe Biden, who also got COVID twice in a month, which wouldn't happen if you just hadn't been vaccinated and you were relying on natural immunity. So the very minimum is that this stuff has been oversold and underperformed. Why can't you say that on UK telly or radio?
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, Dr. Malhotra might be wrong, and the scientists who've been arguing for the vaccine might be right, but that's actually not the point. Nobody in journalism is asking the questions of both sides. Proper debate isn't taking place. Proper, balanced science isn't being considered. You're either on one side or the other, and I promise you, Dr. Malhotra will now find he will be criticised by other people in the industry because he's put his head above the parapet. But as I say, it needs debating. How do we know what's right and what's wrong unless it's debated? But I mean, there has been a deliberate blocking of any kind of stories on vaccine injured or any questions about the validity of the vaccine, there's been a deliberate blocking in newspapers and in television. I mean, we have people in my group, my WhatsApp group, who work in mainstream media, and they tell me their stories are rejected all the time, and people have even been threatened with dismissal. It's been a very hard campaign, which I can understand from the start. I don't understand now because there is so much evidence that A, the vaccines don't work particularly well, and B, they're causing harm.
Well, the BBC's tech editor, whatever that is, was boasting on Twitter, and in fact I think on Radio 4's Today programme the other day, that the BBC had actually succeeded in getting a Facebook group of 250,000 people worldwide, victims and families of vaccine victims, shut down. Why is it the job of a BBC reporter to get vaccine victims' Facebook groups shut down?
Because they're part of something called the Trusted News Initiative, which is a partnership with all of the big tech companies, including Microsoft. They call it an industry collaboration of major news and global tech organisations working together to stop the spread of disinformation. What that actually means is they decide what the story is, and they're blocking everybody. And to block these vaccine injury groups is scandalous. You know, some of the people in those groups are, it's almost like shutting the Samaritans down. People in the groups are considering suicide. They need help. They're being ignored by the National Health. They're being told there's nothing wrong with them, and their lives are completely ruined. So they talk to each other, and actually they use emojis like carrots instead of the syringe. And the BBC were very proud to expose that and stop it, and it's scandalous. It's one thing not reporting it. Yeah, it's one thing not reporting it. It's quite another blocking it.
Yeah. I was astonished by that. It was like listening to something on Pravda or Izvestia from the 1970s. A BBC reporter on Radio 4 boasting about how the BBC was actually silencing people. Thank you very much, Mark, and good luck with that film. We were going to stay on top of this story. That is going to do it for us. Dan Wootton is